Welcome to Sports Lob Media on YouTube. It's your guy Sports Lob with a sports update today, April 22nd, 2026. The Alabama High School Athletic Association baseball first round playoffs for Alabama High School baseball 1A through 6A. The first round games will take place between April 22nd and 25th of 2026. And those will be going on for the next few days. Each game in the series will be best of 3 games, so if you win the first 2, you do not play Game 3. But you will play Game 3 if it's tied 1-1 after 2 games. So, 7A playoffs will be May 1st and 2nd, and I do not have the first round matchups for 7A, but I will have that as a separate video. So right now, let's go over who is going to be playing in the first round matchups with 1A through 6A high school baseball for the state of Alabama. You'll have Victory Christian versus Spring Garden, Pickens Academy versus Hubbardsville, Waterloo versus Skyline, Athens Bible versus Lynn, Eider versus Covenant Christian, Jacksonville Christian versus Appalachian, Berry versus South Lamar, Hacklesburg versus Addison, Elba versus Sweetwater, Milry versus Kinston, Woodland versus Autauga Academy, Billingsley versus University Charter, Verbena versus Fayetteville, Choctaw County versus Brantley, Florala versus Leroy, Keith versus Maplesville. In Class 2A, Summerton Christian versus West End, Westminster at Oak Mountain versus Red Bay, Decatur Heritage versus North Sand Mountain, Bell Green versus Pleasant Valley, Pisgah versus Lindsay Lane, Cleveland versus Cold Springs, Lamar County versus Vincent, Sandrock versus Mars Hill Bible, Luverne versus G.W. Long, J.U. Blackshear versus Cottonwood, Horseshoe Bend versus Tuscaloosa Academy, Lochapoka versus Highland Home, Isabella versus Ranburne, Ariton versus Pike Liberal Arts, Belgreen versus Pleasant Valley, Calhoun versus Reeltown. In Class 3A, you have Glencoe versus J.B. Pennington, Walter Welborn versus Gordo, Clements versus Elkmont, Colbert Heights versus Collinsville, Whitesburg Christian versus Lauderdale County, Vinemont versus Piedmont, Oakman versus Weaver, Geraldine versus Phil Campbell, Hillcrest Evergreen versus Thomasville, T.R. Miller versus Providence Christian, Childersburg versus Thorsby, Lee Scott versus St. James, Hale County versus Altamont, Dallas County versus Excel, Wicksburg versus Cottage Hill Christian, Montgomery Academy versus Glenwood. Excuse me. In Class 4A, it'll be Etowah versus Alexandria, Dora versus Fayetteville County, or there's Dora versus Fayette County, Plainview versus Randolph, Central Florence versus West Morgan, St. John Paul II Catholic versus Madison County, Cherokee County versus Westbrook Christian, Hamilton versus Cordova, Good Hope versus Deschler, Geneva versus Opp, Bayside Academy versus W.S. Neal, Hanley versus Oak Grove, West Blockton versus Trinity Presbyterian, Pleasant Grove versus Mumford, New Brockton versus Houston Academy, Jackson versus Orange Beach, Tallahassee versus Bibb County. In Class 5A, Moody versus Corner, Sipsey Valley versus Leeds, Madison Academy versus Fairview, West Point versus Boaz, Arab versus East Limestone, Springville versus Lincoln, John Carroll Catholic versus American Christian, Sardis versus Russellville, Andalusia versus Headland, Alberta versus Faith Academy, Shelby County versus Demopolis Valley versus Holtville, Jemison versus Briarwood Christian, Eufaula versus Charles Henderson, St. Paul's Episcopal versus UMS Wright, Marbury versus Elmore County. In Class 6A, you'll have Pell City versus Gardendale, Parker versus Mountain Brook, Buckhorn versus Hartselle, Southside versus Coleman, Athens versus Hazel Green, Clay Chalkville versus Oxford, Huffman versus Homewood, Mortimer Jordan versus Fort Payne, Rehoboth versus Stanhope Elmore, Theodore versus Gulf Shores, McAdory versus Spain Park, Brookwood versus Benjamin Russell, Chelsea versus Hueytown, Wetumpka versus Pike Road, McGill-Tulin Catholic versus Saraland, Chilton County versus Northridge, Again, all baseball games will be a best-of-3 series. 1A through 6A playoffs for baseball, high school baseball in the state of Alabama will be between April 22nd through 25th of 2026. First round for Class 7A will be between May 1st and 2nd of 2026. With this sports update today here, April 22nd, 2026, here on Sports Live Media, thank you for taking the time to hear the sports update on Sports Live Media. If you will, please hit the like button, please hit the subscribe button, and please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware of when I'm doing these sports updates, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos, when I broadcast live, or when I have breaking news in the sports world. Thanks and have a wonderful day.